All right. Good afternoon. Boshu and Nishnabé. Hello, friends. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner, and I have the privilege and honor of being the Dean of the S.J. Quinney College of Law here at the University of Utah. My pronouns are she and hers, and it seems really appropriate that as we're here today to talk about this wonderful movie about Indigenous food sovereignty, that we should start today's conversation by reading our relatively new University of Utah land acknowledgement statement. And so the University of Utah has both historical and contemporary relationships with Indigenous peoples. Given that the Salt Lake Valley has always been a gathering place for Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshu, and Ute tribes, and is a crossroad for Indigenous peoples. The University of Utah recognizes the enduring relationships between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We are grateful for the territory upon which we gather here today, or at least those of us who are physically in the Salt Lake Valley gather today. We respect Utah's Indigenous peoples, the original stewards of this land, and we value the sovereign relationships that exist between tribal governments, state governments, and the federal government. Today, approximately 60,000 American Indian and Alaska Native people live in Utah. As a state institution, the University of Utah is committed to serving Native communities throughout Utah in partnership with Native nations and our urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So I'm really pleased that we can start off by acknowledging that statement that the University of Utah adopted back last month in October. So today I'm joined by two others, and each of us was asked to start by briefly giving an introduction to ourselves and then some initial thoughts about this wonderful movie that we all hopefully had a chance to watch. I watched it last night and really enjoyed it quite a bit. And then we'll open it up to questions. So you should see that either a Q&A button or a chat function at the bottom of the screen. So if there's any questions you had about the movie or thought that you want to share about the movie, or responses to anything that the three of us say, please enter it into either the chat or the Q&A. And as soon as we have a chance to kind of share some brief introductory thoughts about the movie, we will move along to the chat and the Q&A, since we want this to be more of an informal conversation today. So I had three thoughts about the movie. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have four thoughts about the movie. The first thought was, this is a great movie. I'll admit that when I turned it on last night, I thought to myself, oh, I'll have it going on in the background and I'll do some email as it's kind of going on in the background. But I have to say, no email got done, which is perhaps not a good thing for work, but it was because I found the movie so engrossing and really interesting. So kind of the first thought was just how wonderful I thought the movie really was. And it really gave me hope, because everyone in the movie was younger than me. And I really appreciated that two of the focuses, kind of the Dubrays and on the Yurok tribe, really focused on this idea of youth being leaders. And even the individual who was highlighted with the White Mountain Apache story was only 39, so still relatively young. And I was just really inspired by this idea that our youth can kind of lead the way and reignite this idea of food sovereignty. So that was the first thought, that I really thought it was a wonderful movie. And if you haven't had a chance to watch it yet, I highly encourage you to do so, although you're not going to get any email done. So just because it's going to be so good and you're just going to watch the movie. The three kind of substantive thoughts that I had was first off, this idea of the different types of sovereignty, I think, is explored in the movie. Next, the movie also raises this question of different methods of genocide. And then also the movie raises this issue of usufructuary rights, because it focuses on gathering and the fact that the Apache woman is actively engaged in gathering. So talking about each one of those, and I should mention that I am a lawyer, law professor, so I look at this movie from the background of a legal background. And I think what's great about this panel is the other two panelists today come from different disciplines and are approaching it from a different perspective. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say from it. But anytime I think about tribal sovereignty, I tend to think about tribal sovereignty from a legal or from a political perspective. So it's this idea that tribal sovereignty persists today. It's by virtue of the inherent sovereignty of tribes. The sovereignty of tribes does not come from the federal government. That's a common misconception. Rather, it is something that comes from their inherent existence that is given to tribes through their citizenry. So just like the citizens of the United States have imbued the federal government with sovereignty, so too do tribal citizens imbue tribal governments with sovereignty. And so in my field, in Indian law, we focus a lot on this issue of how to promote tribal sovereignty, the relationship of tribes as government to government entities with the federal government and state governments, and how that plays out. This movie somewhat touches on that. I mean, certainly it mentions territory and tribal governments, but really focuses in on another type of sovereignty, and that is food sovereignty. And somewhat related to that, we heard a lot from the speakers in the movie, the storytellers of the movie, about the intersection between food sovereignty and cultural and traditional sovereignty, which I think is another way to kind of look at this issue of sovereignty that I found really interesting. And so everybody who was profiled and followed in the movie talked about the importance of food sovereignty and how if tribes don't have food sovereignty, then that impedes their ability to truly have effective political and legal sovereignty, which I thought was a really poignant point. That interconnection with the ability of a government to feed oneself and feed its peoples, and then also to function as a government. But I think the movie goes even one step further. It says it's not enough for us to be able to feed ourselves. We need to be able to feed ourselves healthy and nutritious food. So I think that's kind of the next layer. I really liked the juxtaposition of the Cafe Gajot on the Apache territory was in a convenience store, which he mentioned sold, unhealthy food, lots of sugary food, and they're converting it into this really healthy place. And so combating health and making sure that the citizens are healthy and that connection to food, and then how that connects then to legal and to political sovereignty. But then there's also another layer in it that I think the movie examines, which is this idea of cultural sovereignty, because there was a lot of discussion of how it's not just about having good nutritional food, nutrient-rich food. It's about going back to the traditions of society and of the communities and recapturing those traditions. So for example, you have the citizens of the Apache nations talking about how a lot of their community and ceremonies were focused on the collection of the food and the traditional ways of collecting the food. You also heard a lot from the Dubrays, which I believe was Cheyenne River Sioux, talking about the importance of the buffalo to not only having a healthier environment and healthier culture, but also to their identity as Lakota people. And similarly also with the Yurok tribe, this intersection of the salmon providing not only a really healthy and nutritious resource to make sure that the community stays healthy, but also how spirituality is interconnected. There was one point where they seemed so young to me, they seem like boys, but I know that they're young men, but the young men were talking about how a sadness would kind of pervade the community when the salmon weren't available, and how it wasn't just the loss of food, but it was also kind of the loss of the connection with the salmon. And so I really liked how the movie interweaves these different ideas and points out that, especially for lawyers like me, that there's more than just political and legal sovereignty, that there are these other concepts of sovereignty, such as cultural, spiritual, and food sovereignty. And so I really enjoyed that. The movie also points out and touches on this idea of other methods of genocide. And I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that the movie said something that came up recently. I was talking to some scholars of color, and we were commenting on this, and the movie hit on it too. This idea that for many of us in the United States, we are living in a post-apocalyptic world, that the apocalypse has already happened. So for those of us who are Indigenous, so I myself am a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians in Michigan, the apocalypse happened through colonialization, genocide, and everything that happened to us post first encounter with European nation states. So we are post-apocalypse for many indigenous peoples. I was talking to people of color, and so there are also people of African descent who are saying, the same was true for individuals of African descent. The apocalypse happened when slavery happened and they were removed from their home territory. So I really appreciated that the movie explicitly pointed on that point, said, we are post-apocalypse and we are trying to figure out how to survive after the apocalypse has already happened. And I think that's a point that's sometimes lost in the United States when we talk about the melting pot and this idea of everybody getting together, especially going into the narrative of Thanksgiving. It seems particularly relevant, right? That for some people in this country, we are post-apocalypse. And I appreciated that the movie made that point. And related to that, it talked about different methods of genocide. So, of course, in the United States, when we're talking about indigenous peoples and native peoples, there was the physical genocide, right? There were wars waged against native peoples by the federal government, by the states, by Mexico, based upon where you are. So there was physical genocide, but there were other methods of genocide. So when the physical genocide stopped or was unsuccessful in the late 19th century, the federal government started to utilize other forms of genocide. And the movie touches on this. And so one of the things that the movie points out is the federal government's efforts to destroy the food upon which many native communities relied upon, such as the buffalo. Like the Dubrais talked about their connection and how I think it was 60 million buffalo were slaughtered just to starve the Plains Indians. And that was not unique to the Plains Indians. That happened all over the country. They also talked about another method of genocide, which was boarding schools. So the idea was to rip Indian children oftentimes away from their homes and send them to these boarding schools. I myself actually worked at a former boarding school. Haskell Indian Nations University was formerly Haskell boarding school, and so had that history myself. And the idea was that if we force the assimilation into children, that they'll no longer be Indian. You might have heard the phrase, kill the Indian to save the child. That was kind of the mantra of the boarding schools. And so that was another way of cultural genocide. And then another method, it wasn't mentioned in the movie, but that we're certainly familiar with in the legal field, was through this allotment process, where tribal land that was held communally was taken and divided up into individual allotments. And the thought was to kind of make all Indians gentlemen farmers, like Thomas Jefferson was the model, make us all gentlemen farmers, assimilate us into the dominant Christian society, and then there'll no longer be this Indian culture. So I appreciated that the movie really dug into those different layers of genocide. And notably, these are not historical things. So part of the reason why we have the Indian Child Welfare Act in the 1970s is because that removal of Indian children was still happening well into the 1970s. And many would argue that it's still happening today, where we see a disproportionately significant percentage of Indian children being removed from Indian households and being put into non-Indian households. So these are not historical events. Many of these things are still have roots today. And last but not least, and then I want to turn it over to Franci for her wonderful discussion, was just this idea of usufructuary rights. And just want to make the point that you saw the citizen of the Apache Nation who was doing the gathering in the traditional ways throughout the movie. And I do want to point out that gathering is a usufructuary right, so a use right that's tied with the land. And so many tribes will have these usufructuary rights outside of the traditional territories. Oftentimes we talk about it in terms of hunting and fishing, but gathering is also included in those usufructuary rights and can be very, very important to tribes, as we saw in this movie. And usufructuary rights, or tribal treaty rights, off-reservation tribal treaty rights, are one of the few areas where tribes actually have had significant success in the federal courts. So even most recently in United States versus Washington, which was looking at tribal fishing rights, off-reservation fishing rights, there the Supreme Court held in favor of the tribes. So a lot of tribes have these off-reservation rights, whether they're gathering rights or hunting or fishing rights. And those were traditional homelands that the tribe reserved in the treaty. And that is an area where the federal government has been very protective of those rights. So I really appreciated that the movie kind of demonstrated that and explored the intersection. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Franci Taylor, who is going to have a different perspective as she comes from a different discipline. Franci.
Thank you. Yokoke. Halito, Akchimnekja. I'm Kasawasat Kita Pahasa Kisquayo, or Franci Taylor. I'm Choctaw and Cheyenne, and I'm the director of the American Indian Resource Center here at the University of Utah. And I'm going to take a little bit different approach into how I related to this really amazing movie, because my background is I've taught in Europe in a faculty of archaeology. That's where I've got my degrees, and I look at it from TEKs, traditional ecological knowledge, as a storyteller. And I was told from the time that I was very young that it was my obligation as a representation of the seventh generation. And seventh generation isn't a generation. Seventh generation is a recognition that somebody 7 generations behind me persevered, survived, carried knowledge so that I could do the same thing for 7 generations beyond me. So that knowledge and relationship is more important than the person. I'm just an intersection on this massive spider web that connects us back to virtually every kind of people. When we talk in my first language about plants and animals, we speak of them as people. We talk about the rock people and the plant people, and it's this relationship. We do land acknowledgements, and recently Elizabeth was part of a webinar, and one of the people in that said something that really, really touched my heart, because land is perceived as a commodity in our capitalistic environment. And he talked not about land, but as place. And as a scientist, when you look at strontium isotope analysis on human remains, you find the land that they were connected to. And so the land is a connection. It's our bloodline. It's in our origin stories, we say that we're stardust that fell to earth. Wow, because astrophysics now tell us that humanity is stardust that fell to earth. And here we people that were considered primitive have held this extremely important scientific knowledge for vast millennia. Speaking of the buffalo, if you have buffalo and you cook it, you will find out that the fat never turns hard and crystallized like lard does. I struggle when people talk about getting together to have traditional American Indian food and they haul out the fry bread, because that always kind of makes me go, oh, that's not traditional. Most people don't even know that flour did not exist in the Americas, the wheat did not, nor did the sugar. People don't realize that sugar is absolutely intimately tied to slavery. The very first slave ship to come to the Americas was in 1516, with people brought from Africa to grow sugar, because the Spanish realized that sugar would be a commodity that was highly addictive and would be a commodity that they could make millions off of in their own time. It was more important than gold. So we ignore these intersections in our history. So fry bread to me is not traditional. What I would consider traditional are the 3 sisters, which are corn, beans, and squash. Now the 3 sisters are really interesting in an ecological way because they're grown together and they're eaten together. They're viewed as feminine. because the societies were matriarchal. And so the clan mother owned the gardens where these three were planted. They live in a symbiotic relationship. Corn comes up first. The beans then wrap around the corn stalk to support them. The squash leaves protect the roots of the bean and the corn. And so together they become a perfect family. If you lived on a diet of just corn, like was fed to slaves, you end up getting a disease called pellagra. And pellagra is something that leaches all of the vitamin B out of your system and makes your nerve endings raw and you become demented. So one of the reasons that slavery perpetuated this myth of the non-whites being less able is because they were being fed poison. If you take corn and beans together, the nitrogen in the beans neutralizes the enzyme in the corn and you hit stasis. That means it's not good, it's not bad. Add squash and you've added protein, fiber, and everything to make a complete diet. So thousands of years ago, corn was first grown in Mexico between 9 and 10,000 years ago. So people gathered in these millennia this knowledge of what the importance of the plant was as a relative to the people. One of the things that's in traditional ecological knowledge that is troubling is when Northern European society created this image that they were the epitome of all humanity. This is embedded across our culture. We see it in things like when you're in a meeting that's going negatively, they say, well, this meeting went south. Well, why did it not go west or east or whatever? Because in Northern Europe, south were people of darker skin. And so embedded in these concepts that we never even think about is this residual racism that we still perpetrate. So the concept coming in was that Native people were primitive. That goes back to the concepts of barbarians, primitives, and civilized. So only white men of means were considered civilized. So when they came in, they dismissed a lot of Native knowledge, such as when you cook buffalo, the fat doesn't ever solidify. It is the same thing as eating a lot of salmon. Those are omega-3s that prevent and will cure heart disease. If you have very high cholesterol and are having heart problems, eat more buffalo and salmon, traditional American Indian foods, and you will find that your condition improves. When Lewis and Clark came across to investigate this empty land, they carried maps. That's never written into most of the history about Lewis and Clark, but they carried maps that had been given to them and created by the Cree and the Blackfeet prior to them coming across. They were definitely not the first. I mean, David Thompson made it across Canada 60 years before Lewis and Clark. So this wasn't this vast tour of discovery. It was an invasion to claim land that was not theirs. I used to do a thing in my classes where I'd take somebody's purse and try to sell it to somebody. And they'd say, you can't do that, it's not yours. And I'd say, well, it's in my hands. I can describe everything in it. To get across the fact that it didn't matter if Spain sold the land of France, who sold it to the US. It wasn't theirs to begin with, which brings us back to the land acknowledgement of who these lands as people, the land as a person, belong to. So when Lewis and Clark came across, they noted all the plants that they were not familiar with and the absence of plants they were familiar with. And one of them is this big plant that we call mullein. It has huge leaves. The first year it lays completely flat on the ground. The second year it grows really tall and it has these beautiful yellow flowers that are great if you want to dye quills or wool to make a really pretty yellow material. So that plant was introduced by the British. It's a British Northern European plant brought to the Americas as an ornamental. It cannot grow in land that has not been disturbed. So when Lewis and Clark came through, they saw no mullein. When Lewis and Clark headed back to St. Louis, they met around 1,600 fur trappers that were headed upriver to gather beaver and other pelts. So by the time Thwaites, who was a botanist, came through 27 years later, a lot of the land had been disturbed by wagons, etc. He found mullein everywhere, and it was being utilized by a lot of the plains tribes that suffered from bronchitis, from smoky lodges and everything. They would build it like a sweat lodge, an enclosed area. They would take the wet mullein leaves and throw them on the fire to create a barrier of smoke. So people would sit in these extremely smoky, dense lodges to cure bronchitis. Now you'd think that that's counterproductive. I mean, smoke, bronchitis, isn't that what causes it? Well, today we know that the mullein plant in its leaves contains a bronchodilator. So how did they know in 20 some years the internal structure of a plant that was not alien, or that was alien? Same thing with acorns. You have to wash and leach them 4 times before they're healthy. If you eat them on the first time, they're deadly poisonous because of the tannin in them. I've often had students, I've asked students, well, how do you think they knew this? And they say, well, trial and error. I say, I don't know about you guys, but if I kill one of my family on the first time I feed them something, I'm not real sure I'm going to wash it and try it again. We had inherent knowledge. We contain this knowledge still in our bloodstream, in our muscle, in our minds. That knowledge is embedded in our DNA. This is something that the colonizers tried to remove from our children, this inherent important relationship. We didn't have rights. The people that I grew up around, the elders that I grew up around, always told me, you do not have any rights. You have responsibilities. In fact, if I translated what my name is, it is defining what my responsibility to my community is. And once you fulfill those responsibilities and those obligations, rights are automatically there. So my closing words before I turn it to Thomas is that we need to go back. We need to reconnect our children to the umbilical of the earth. We need to protect the earth. One of the biggest problems we have with so-called ecologists is they think to be ecologically sound, you must remove the people from the land. I say no. You must allow us as people to nourish and embrace and care for the land so it becomes our relative again. With that, I want to say yeah, okay, and turn it over to Thomas. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Director Taylor. Thank you also to University of Utah Alumni Relations, and also to Dean Warner for joining me today. My name is Thomas Michael Swenson. I'm assistant professor at the University of Utah Division of Ethnic Studies School of Transformation. I am born and raised in Kodiak Island. I am enrolled at Kodiak, the Woody Island tribe, as well as original shareholder in Lesnoy Village, which is the village corporation of Woody Island, and as well as Kodiak Incorporated, which is my larger region. Both of those corporations based on the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. I guess some of my initial thoughts made me think about my own upbringing in Kodiak, the Kodiak Archipelago, and how lucky I was to be born and raised in Kodiak. And I ate salmon most every day, as did most of my friends. I say something that actually changed, and I think sort of an intervention here for me personally would be that there was the Exxon oil Exxon oil spill in 1989 when I was a teenager. And that changed the economy and the lifestyles of people in southern Alaska most drastically. My father, who had been working in the seafood industry his entire life, didn't work a day after that. He just recently passed, and also. So that is something that speaks to me, and the industry and the lifestyle haven't quite returned. However, that is a very distinct kind of thing to say, opposed to what we saw in these films, because the history of Alaska and the people of Alaska, the villagers, being distant from the contiguous part of the United States, have a distinct participation in the creation of Alaska, in that Alaska was sold part and parcel as part of Russia to the United States, and so to talk about food sovereignty is something distinct for people from Alaska, or for Alaska more generally, because Russia wasn't an empire that recognized the Pope or any sort of doctrine of discovery. And in that sense, if we're thinking about indigeneity and this kind of indigeneity incorporated kind of mentality that we see in the universities these days, Stalin was indigenous, right? He was an indigenous Georgian. And so when we start thinking about Kodiak and where I'm from, and this relationship to natural foods, I mean, they're sort of inseparable, and I feel really lucky that my say elementary school teachers were Native people. And I was just thinking of an elder named Larry Matfay, and he was more of the person who would come around to each grade, each grade, and give a talk. And he had this great talk where he would show the rain gear, the traditional rain gear of Kodiak Islanders, are made out of seal intestines. So they're wrapped up, and sewn up. And what he used to like to say to the children was, "You eat it, we wear it." Kind of this, the difference between sausage and the traditional rain gear. And so, really, the film spoke to me about this kind of second point that I was really thinking about, is the history of these three different peoples, and also often the people of the Americas are thought of as one person, while the people from the larger continents are thought of as all these different kinds of people. The Eastern, the Western, the Northern, the Southern. And this film is very successful in showing how food cultures can delineate different kinds of people. And of course, I think they were all very striking. And me being someone from the Salmon Nation, as they might say, the Yurok story, I found very appealing, and also the story about the people of the plains, and but also of the White Mountain Apache. And so I think all three of these histories that they have with the United States, or with the various Spanish post-colonial countries, tell a much different story than to one another, which really brings me to what I'm thinking about the film is, what is it saying about Native cultural citizenship, where Dean Warner was talking about these forms of citizenship. And so is the film presenting us with that all people, that these various Native peoples have their own cultural citizenship as everyone else in the United States, or is this a way to define, a distinct way of understanding the world? And that's just something I think what was motivated me thinking about this film is that these people were engaged in defining themselves, or having themselves defined through these various ways of nourishment. And then I think my final point, one thing I found really striking is all of these the people, the interviewees, all had these really great stories of redemption, and you know, every single one. I mean, we could take any one of these people, and they really, except for maybe the high school student, the college student, but the majority of the people had been, you know, found themselves, and this is where they turn. This is where this, traditional foods is where they found themselves, and I think that speaks a lot to the power of food, power, and the power of food and the power of place. So those are my sort of 90-mile-an-hour thoughts. So thank you very much. Thank you.
That was great. I really enjoyed listening to both of you. And again, I think just the fact that you had, we all had just such disparate reactions to the movie, although overall positive, just talks about all the great themes in the movie. So again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to enter those. And we have a couple of questions to start us off. So how common are the experiences of those in the film? For example, the lack of grocery stores close to people to have access to food, and this idea of food deserts. So in your experiences, is this kind of just a couple of rare stories, or is this more of a common experience? Go.
I'll jump in. It's extremely common, especially in the West. I mean, one of the things we talk about in health sciences is the fact that the Navajo Reservation is over 27,000 square miles. That's a third the size or a little more of the state of Utah. And in that entire area, there's 13 grocery stores, and 8 of them are located in the major cities like Tuba City, Shiprock, Window Rock. And so there is a convenience store at home on my reservation. If you don't use that, you're 140 miles from a Costco. So it's extremely common, because our reservations were little pieces of all the land that we once owned that were located in areas that at the time they were established, the central government did not find that land productive. A lot of oil and stuff hidden under some of that land, which now they've regretted. But at the time, it was a purposeful placement out of the way and out of the sight, and often away from our traditional lands.
I mean, I would echo that. That's been my experience as well. That was certainly true where I grew up. Again, there was a convenience store on the reservation, but that was it. And so if you wanted something else, you'd have to travel a pretty significant distance to get it. And I would also say that it's not, the idea of food deserts is not unique to Indian country. This is something that I think challenges a lot of community of color and lower socioeconomic communities. I know when I first started my legal career, I was practicing in Washington, D.C. and lived in Washington, D.C., Southeast D.C. And that was an overwhelmingly Black population. And there was one grocery store in all of Southeast DC. And I remember being there, and I was trying to make something. I don't remember what I was trying to make, but I was just trying to find an onion. And I couldn't find a single onion that wasn't rotten. All the produce was, or I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority of the produce was rotten. So they only seemed to have access to, kind of processed foods, canned foods. And so I was privileged enough. I had a car, I could drive to Virginia. I drove to Virginia. Sounds more impressive than it actually was, but I would drive to Virginia to get my produce because I couldn't get it at my local grocery store. And so these issues of having access to food and having access to healthy, nutritious food are not unique to Indian country, but it was certainly my experience as well growing up. Thomas?
Oh, thank you. That's a great story. Thank you. As I was painting this sort of rosy picture, this dancing salmon picture, I would say growing up in Kodiak isn't necessarily the place where you're going to find the freshest of fruit. And so I ate a lot of canned broccoli, things like, just wonderful food like that. I was in Juneau recently, and Juneau is close to the contiguous part of the United States. And there is a supermarket in the main downtown where a lot of working people don't live, right downtown there. But bananas, I think, were $1.65 a pound, in just at a grocery store in a very populated part of Alaska. And my better half is from Colombia, and she was very surprised. She's from Antioquia in Colombia, and so she was very surprised about food deserts in the United States and how people in North America are always trying to define Latin America as being, yeah, I mean, we're talking billions of people and wonderful cities, but that, trying to paint Latin America in a certain way when the inequality between Colombia and the United States isn't that different. Yeah, and so, yeah, I mean, I lived in Arizona and New Mexico for a while, and if you don't have a car and you're out there, that's really tough, I would say. So, thank you.
Yeah, I have to say there was a moment in the movie, they were showing an older video and it had the commodity products. I don't know if anybody else noticed it, but like the white box of the powdered milk and like the can of chicken. I actually got I had a hunger pain because that's what I grew up on. And I was like, oh, it's the good food.
Do you remember the first time you saw one of the commodity cans that was in color?
I know, that was such a big deal. Right. Yeah, no, I have to chuckle because as we think about Thanksgiving and our Thanksgiving recipes, a lot of my family's recipes all involve Velveeta because that was all we had. I didn't realize that there was any sort of cheese other than Velveeta, I think, until I was 10. So if you come over to my house for Thanksgiving, you're getting a lot of Velveeta.
I think you used to be able to buy a car if you had a couple of the logs of commodity cheese. It was good.
Good stuff.
And
yeah,
potted meat.
Yeah.
I still love potted meat.
It's true. It's kind of funny. In terms of that, I now have the privilege to buy all this, nice, great produce and everything, and I want Velveeta. So the next question was, how can non-Native people provide support to those communities fighting for sovereignty?
Ask. I mean, one of the biggest problems with people who really wish to help is they still believe that their way of helping, their concepts of what's helping, it's like, how do you define success? Because I guarantee it's not going to be how I define success. I mean, for me, success is seeing the students I work with succeed. It has nothing to do with me. So when you want to help, you have to reach out to communities and say, I would love to help. What do you want me to do?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, maybe I was thinking two things. Maybe I guess try if people are trying to help, would be to allow the people to speak for themselves, and also to maybe not be active in trying to find pathologies. Pathologizing different groups of people. I guess that would be helpful. I guess. Thank you.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with both of those points. And then I would add on, if you want to, if you're here in the Salt Lake community, Franci runs our American Indian Resource Center. So I am sure she would love to hear from you if you wanted to make some sort of donation or work with the center on campus. Although I just spoke for you, Franci. Is that correct?
Oh, please.
Let people speak for themselves.
No, thank you. One of the things that you will find when you talk to a lot of American Indian people is that we need allies. We really do. I'm not saying don't do it. I keep a food pantry open at the American Indian Resource Center, the AIRC, because so many of the students I work with don't have enough money to go to school and eat at the same time. I mean, they're looking at buying books, at housing and travel to get to the university when we're open for in-person classes. But I keep a food pantry there just because that's sometimes the only meal some of these students have. So we love donations. Number one reason why American Indian students across the country, and we are the most diverse population of any, that they cannot complete their degrees is because lack of funding. So yes, we can desperately, desperately need support.
Yes, and I would add, so American Indian Resource Center here on campus, Franci's absolutely correct. I was reading an article that said just nationwide, 30 to 40% of college students are food insecure. So that's just in general. And then my experience is the same, that a lot of our Native students in particular are experiencing food insecurity. Here also in outside of the University of Utah, there's the Urban Indian Community Center here in Salt Lake that provides a lot of support for urban Indian community. So if you have any interest in donating there. We also have a Title VI Lil Feathers program for the Salt Lake City Valley area that supports children 0 to 18. So you can provide support there. And then if you want to directly support a tribe, I encourage you to reach out to one of our many federally recognized tribes here in Utah to see what they may need assistance with. So there's lots of opportunity to help right now. And I'm sure any of those organizations would love to hear from you.
Adopt an Elder, Running Strong programs. There's just so many, so much need.
So very true. Yeah, I know our Native American Law Students Association right now is doing a big donation drive for the Navajo Nation. So there's lots of need. I'm sure if you reach out, people will be willing to take you up on it.
Can I throw one more in real quick?
Sure.
Another thing our students desperately need is dedicated mentors. We have students that are going into various fields, but they have no one to mentor them on the process. So if you're alumni and you're watching this, reach out, because we have students that would love to have a mentor in all professions.
So very true. So next, how have issues like food sovereignty and other social economic problems impacted the results of COVID-19 within the Native community? So do we see any sort of intersection between food insecurity and COVID-19?
I have students that are taking every cent they have to take food back to the reservation with them, and water. What people don't understand is that much of the Navajo reservation is on bedrock. You can't drill a well to get water. There's no water there. So people are hauling water sometimes 100 miles each way once a week. So how do you wash your hands when you don't have access to tap water?
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about and what the movie talks about, of that connection between having nutrient rich food and health, and the historical result of the federal government and other colonial powers would destroy the native food sources of indigenous peoples, which made them unhealthy. I mean, in some instances, killed some populations, and then the remaining populations were left with significant health deficits. And then you add on, so you have that historical trauma of the native foods being taken away. Then you add on what we were talking about before, where a lot of our indigenous communities have these food deserts and don't have access to nutritional food. And so you have communities that already have disproportionately high numbers of diabetes and heart problems, cancer, suicide. And so then you layer a global pandemic on top of that. And so I think that connection between the lack of food security, health, and then of course just the fact that COVID-19 is horrific, you already have a population that has been historically traumatized, and now you're adding this layer of a pandemic. And so it would make sense, and as we've seen in some tribes, that we've seen an increased percentage rate on infections, and that just makes sense when you put it all into its historical context.
I've been thinking about the ongoing debate, and maybe it's over right now, and whether or not Alaska Native Corporation should have COVID funding or not. The tribes have taken the corporations to task for this. And I think what people may not know is that these corporations are, are resultants of activism. I mean, these corporations came out of people, taking out second mortgages to somehow square away things with the United States. And so I was just, it just popped in my head. So I was, because I received something from the tribe, from Woody Island, the tribe, like a form for COVID relief, but I didn't know where that had fallen yet because it was still kind of bouncing around out there. But that is something that is happening. These fights at the courts between the tribes and Alaska Native corporations. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this seems like a good question to perhaps end on. So looking ahead, obviously next week is Thanksgiving. And excuse me, as Americans prepare to celebrate Thanksgiving, what are some things people should keep in mind to honor the history of Native American communities?
Well, the mythical Thanksgiving came about because when the Pilgrims were at the point where they had no food and were cannibalizing both their own graves and native graves, somebody came out of the woods to help them. And today he's called Squanto. But he was there at that point because he'd been kidnapped as a 7-year-old child and taken to Spain, then to France, finally made his way to England and came back. When he returned to the Americas, his entire tribe had been wiped out due to smallpox. So he stepped in because it gave him a place to be helpful and to be incorporated into a community. Of course, the community did give him smallpox and he didn't live for more than 2 years after they brought him in. Thanksgiving was not even created until under Lincoln, when they were trying to bring the country together under a type of a holiday. If you look at the colonial documents for the Pilgrims, they were celebrating every other week for some small thing. So what we teach children in school is as big a myth and misconception as the Easter Bunny.
I know from my perspective, I get asked that quite a bit. I remember once when at my prior institution, it was the Wednesday or the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and a colleague popped by and was like, "Oh, happy Thanksgiving," and then said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I probably shouldn't wish you a happy Thanksgiving." For me, speaking personally, I appreciate the sentiment behind Thanksgiving, the idea of gathering as a family and being thankful and grateful for what we have. But I very much do it with the caveat that Franci just gave. I mean, we need to disconnect it from that myth because it truly is a myth. I love that she just said it's like essentially the same thing as an Easter bunny, and stop perpetuating the myth. So I think if we just celebrate Thanksgiving for this idea of a time to reflect and be thankful for what we have, that's a great idea. And I think a lot of people in Indian country would get behind that idea, right? We're blessed and being thankful, but let's get rid of the fake feathers and the narrative and just focus on the Thanksgiving and the family blessings moving forward. So I appreciate that Franci shared that history, because I like to eat turkey. I like to stuff myself on Thursday, and I like to see my family. I do not at all like the Indians saved the Pilgrims story. In fact, Thanksgiving is the end of my least favorite 6 weeks of the year that run from Columbus Day to Halloween, when people inevitably dress up in some way that they shouldn't, to all of the perpetuations of the myths that Franci just talked about at Thanksgiving. So I'm always a little happy to see Thanksgiving go too.
My father always said, "Hey, if we've got nothing else to be thankful for, despite how hard they tried, they didn't wipe us out." And anything with food. I love any celebration with food.
Absolutely. Thomas, final thoughts?
Just echoing what both of you have had to say. So I do feel a bit of ambivalence about it, or maybe another, maybe so. But especially in a time right now, people can sure use some time to relax. So thank you.
One of the things I've always wondered is why the Pilgrims? They weren't the first Europeans, that was the Vikings. They weren't the first permanent colony for the English, that was Jamestown. They didn't establish the first permanent city, that was St. Augustine. Why the Pilgrims? Because they're not the first or the best at anything.
Well, on that note of why the Pilgrims, I like this. Let's turn it into the Viking narrative. Can we say that the natives saved the Vikings? I somehow like that a little bit better. So I think that's a really great note. I have very much enjoyed this conversation. And so I want to thank my co-panelists for taking your time today. Again, if you haven't had a chance to watch the movie, highly recommend it. It's a great movie. And we hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving / the Pilgrim or the Vikings, no, the natives saved the Vikings day.
And
all right, everyone. Shay McGwitch, have a great weekend.